Alright, young historians, welcome back to the third and final part of Chapter 19 lecture. We're right here with Taft's troubles. Taft is going to handily win the presidency in 1908. He is Theodore Roosevelt's hand-picked successor. He's pretty popular, Theodore Roosevelt, and if he wanted to run for a third term, there probably would have been a lot of support for that, but of course there's still this precedent set by Washington that a president only has 2 terms, and Theodore Roosevelt is going to stick with that. So in 1908, Taft is going to become president, and Theodore Roosevelt is off to Africa to go big game hunting. That will not be the last that we see of Theodore Roosevelt. But Taft, for now, he is a bigger trust buster than Theodore Roosevelt. Taft tended to take a less positive view of trusts and monopolies, and he broke up more than the trust buster himself did. He also tends to be more conservative than Roosevelt. He's less progressive, and that will come to be a problem over time. And the Republican Party will eventually split between conservative and progressive wings, and Taft will find himself siding with the conservatives more often than not. To speak about foreign policy now, we're actually going to take a little bit of a step back into Theodore Roosevelt's presidency, where we see America take control of Panama and build the Panama Canal. The Hay-Boone-Alvaria Treaty in 1904 is going to grant American access to this 10-mile wide strip of land, and we basically have it in perpetuity. We pay them a fee up front, and then each year after that we're supposed to pay a certain amount as well. That is, of course, no longer going to be the case. I can't remember the year that land and that canal went back to Panama, but it's no longer under our control. We're not paying Panama money for it anymore. And it's kind of a shady deal how we get that. We basically extend support for Panamanian independence from Colombia, and then in return we receive access to land to build this canal. Your chapter will tell you a little bit more about that in depth. Theodore Roosevelt was probably aware of all this too. In his own, I think it was an autobiography that he wrote, he simply says about this matter, "I took the canal zone," and he doesn't choose to go into a lot of detail with how it happened. The canal is completed in 1914, just in time for the First World War. Making the Caribbean an American lake, we see, oh dear. There we go. Making the Caribbean an American lake. We see American influence extended all across the Caribbean and throughout Latin America during the Progressive Era. Roosevelt is going to issue something very famous that you've got to be familiar with, the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. You might recall that the Monroe Doctrine said that the Western Hemisphere was no longer open for any further European colonization. You want to look for a new colony? Well, you're not going to do it here in the Western Hemisphere. Okay? Roosevelt's going to go a step further and say that if anything in the Western Hemisphere, if anybody needs to be policed, needs to be helped or controlled, the United States will take that role, and Europe is free to stay the heck away from Western hemispherical situations and troubles. And so definitely make sure you're familiar with that idea. Taft and Wilson are going to continue to expand Roosevelt's policy, Roosevelt's corollary. Dollar diplomacy is going to be one way that this happens. Dollar diplomacy is going to see American business encouraged to expand overseas, and the idea here is that we should encourage American investment in other nations, both to bring them into this international economic sphere and also to make sure that American interests are being served by these other nations and within these other nations. Dollar diplomacy is something, it's kind of controversial, and the term, it's meant to be derisive, kind of like muckrakers, it's meant to be derisive, and now it's not really used in a derisive fashion all the time, but make sure you're familiar with dollar diplomacy. And by the end of the Progressive Era, there are several U.S. protectorates, in and around South America, the Caribbean. Cuba's going to be one, Panama's going to be one, there's 4 or 5 that your chapter talks about. Roosevelt and Eastern Asia. Roosevelt built on the open door notes to maintain an American presence in China. America is also going to participate in actions against the Boxer Rebellion in China, further solidifying American interests within China. The Treaty of Portsmouth, TR negotiates this treaty between Russia and Japan, who had gone to war over claims within Asia, within China, Korea, and some other areas. TR's negotiation of this peace treaty is actually going to lead him to win the Nobel Peace Prize, and I think that he gets that actually in 1906 for that. But that's not going to be the only thing that he does with Japan. He also negotiates the Gentleman's Agreement. The Gentleman's Agreement is going to it's Japan agreeing that they will limit the immigration of Japanese laborers to America, and this comes after there's been a little bit of drama. I think it's out in California. There's a Supreme Court case that ends up saying that Japanese school children who had initially been told they had to attend Chinese schools, saying that they don't have to. Japan is kind of pressuring America to treat Japanese citizens over here, or Japanese Americans, in a fair manner. Japan takes it pretty seriously. The chapter, I think, at one point says that they're like even hinting at war over how America is treating people of Japanese descent. And so Theodore Roosevelt does everything that he can to cool those tensions and to maintain favorable status and favorable relations with Japan. Japan really is treated more as a civilized nation than other non-European nations. Japan has tried to be an imperial power in order to stand up to other imperial powers ever since the 1850s, ever since Matthew Perry and all that business that we spoke about a few chapters ago. So make sure you're familiar with Japan's role in imperialism. We will absolutely come back to Japan. I'm thinking here of World War II, of course. But Japan is not going to be the only imperial power. We see the scramble for Africa happening at this time too. The Berlin Conference, you might remember learning about that in modern world history or in AP Euro perhaps. But we see European powers and other powers involved in colonization so that they can maintain access to markets, so that they can maintain access to raw goods to fuel their industries. All of this is happening at the same point in time, so make sure you're kind of putting those on one timeline in your head. And to solidify America's status as a world power and to demonstrate to the world the might and the power of the brand new American Navy, which is built to secure and maintain American access to markets, the Great White Fleet is going to be built. It's 16 ships. They're painted white because it's supposed to be this peaceful sort of color. It's got some peace symbolism behind it, perhaps. But TR builds it and he sails it around the world just to kind of show off what Americans have built and what we're capable of. And moving on here, the election of 1912 is going to be actually a four-way race, and it's a hot mess. Like, honestly, if you think 2016 was a mess, like, 1912 can give it a run for its money. If you remember the election of 1800 between Adams and Jefferson and what a mess that was, like, honestly, 1912 might give it a run for its money too. It's Taft, the incumbent, versus Theodore Roosevelt, who has come back and is now head of the Bull Moose Party, versus Wilson, running as a Democrat, versus Debs, running as a socialist. The Republicans, of course, are divided between Taft and TR. Woodrow Wilson is going to handily win the presidency here in 1912, and he will, of course, be reelected again in 1916, but we'll get there in due time. The Democrats also are going to win Congress. Wilson and reform. Wilson believed in an active role for the president in policy making, and he's a very accomplished writer, speaker, intellectual. He's actually the first president since John Adams to address Congress in person, not simply by writing them a letter or sending somebody else in his stead to air what his thoughts might be when it comes to congressional action. He actually addresses Congress himself, which is going to be unique for the time. He also supports the Underwood Tariff, which reduced tariffs. And how did they make up for lost revenue that they previously would have gained through a tariff? Well, it's through a graduated income tax, of course. The income tax came around through the 16th Amendment. And I'm actually flipping through my chapter now. I've got to confess something to you folks. The 16th and 17th Amendments always get confused in my head, and I'm not entirely sure why, but if I remember correctly, the 16th is graduated income tax, and the 17th is direct election of senators. And I'm flipping through right now. Here we go. The 16th is indeed income tax. Sweet, I was right. I don't have to re-record this part of lecture. That's fantastic. This income tax is something that we still deal with today. Your parents might be able to tell you a little bit more about that. We're supposed to file our taxes by April 15th. So moving on, we've also got the Federal Reserve System created under Wilson. That's going to be one of the longest lasting reforms from his time in office. It's a banking system that can direct our money flow, that can direct policy, direct interest rates, basically just to coordinate national level economic activity. It's something that you need if you're going to be a nation as widespread and as rich as America. So the Federal Reserve System, definitely be familiar with that. The Clayton Antitrust Act is going to be one of these, it's sort of one of the final pieces of progressive legislation from progressivism right here before World War I. The Clayton Antitrust Act does not support breaking up trusts all the time, but it says regulate them instead. The Clayton Antitrust Act also specifies that, unions are going to be okay and other types of organization are okay. Trusts themselves do not always have to be broken up. Some trusts will not be allowed. There are some also types of management that are not going to be allowed here. But this is really more TR style in that trusts can be allowed as long as they're going to be operating on the up and up and in the public interest. You can simply regulate them, not abolish them all the time. The Federal Trade Commission Act is also going to be established, providing for increased federal oversight of interstate commerce, which of course is a very constitutional thing. Moving on, we've got the transformation of American politics and government. Roosevelt and Wilson are both going to assert presidential authority, and Americans are going to come to expect domestic policy directives and a lot more authority to come from the White House. The president is not a figurehead. The president is somebody who can shine a national spotlight on issues that we need to solve, and the president can also recommend specific legislation that we need to focus on. These increased expectations and increased authority for the president come out of these two presidencies. Definitely make sure that you understand that. The reforms that we see at this point in time also are not going to fulfill all the expectations of proponents. We don't see anything really go 100%. No reformer will get everything that they want, but that really is just politics. Moving on to cultural expression, make sure you're familiar with different ways that culture is going to transform at this point in time, from the works of Mark Twain, Kate Chopin, Émile Zola, to the Impressionist paintings of Mary Cassatt, to the ragtime stylings of Scott Joplin. Make sure you're familiar with these people who represent cultural transition as well. The Ashcan School, of course, is going to be more of a realistic style of painting, derisively called, of course, the Ashcan School. The Armory Show, a very, very famous art show, I believe 1913 is the year on that showcases all of these different works. Mass entertainment is made possible by transportation and by advertisement. And we also see national culture in the form of baseball really getting started. Shout out here to Fifth Hour. There's a History Day project in Fifth Hour that is about baseball. I'll probably be asking you young historians to share with the class a little bit more about your research there, simply because you do know more about that than me. And then there are ways that Americans also celebrate this new age and these new cultural phenomena, exhibits, fairs, celebrations, particularly the Columbian Exposition in Chicago, are meant to bring Americans an awareness of what are all these new things that we have created and that we are doing, that we're capable of doing. It's a really beautiful way, I think, for Americans to embrace progress. Finally, we have progressivism in perspective. Throughout this chapter, we've talked about different types of reforms, from the municipal or city level all the way through constitutional amendments. Remember, the 16th is income tax, 17th is direct election of senators, 18th is prohibition, 19th is women's right to vote. There's been this overall focus on efficiency and expertise with regard to public policy. There's also been greater potential for individual participation in politics. Women are included especially in this. Black Americans are unfortunately largely still excluded. We will see that position change over time, but right now, during the progressive era, Black Americans will still unfortunately lag behind in terms of political and civic equality. Political parties' influence is going to give way to interest groups and organizations, and even individual voters who, again, in the initiative, recall, and referendum, are able to exert influence over politics. And there's also been this increased role of the federal government in regulating business and in regulating personal lives. With business, I'm thinking here of the Hepburn Act, I'm thinking here of the Federal Trade Commission, and with personal lives, I'm thinking here of things like temperance. So this is progressivism as we see it at the turn of the century. This is a very fundamental chapter and a very fundamental idea to understand as America begins the 20th century, the American century as it's called. So definitely make sure that you read this chapter carefully. Let me know if you have any questions about your take-home quiz, and I look forward to seeing all of you on Monday. Thank you.